Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in for the Commander's Core Studio. Welcome to the show. So, Strixhaven spoiler season keeps on going. And in this spoiler season, we have seen a lot of firsts, including the first MDFC Sorcery Commander. We've also seen the first sorcery that you can have any number of in your deck. And we've also seen the first mono white card draw spell. Well, kind of. Ish. To learn more about that one and my take on it, make sure you check that episode out. But this episode is on something, let's just say, a bit more explosive than that. Because this episode is on the very first Triple X Sorcery. That's right, you're not seeing things, that's 3 X's in that mana cost. So, to find out what this new card is and what it does, let's jump into it. Crackle with Power is a sorcery for XXX red. It says Crackle with Power deals 5 times X damage to each of up to X targets. So, though you do have to dump a good amount of mana into this, there can be a huge payoff. The more mana that you dump into this, the more damage that you do, and the more targets you get to choose. So essentially, let's just break this down on what you can cast it for. If X is 1, you're going to pay 5 mana in total and deal 5 damage to 1 target. Now that can be useful if you need this in a pinch, but you're definitely not going to want to do that too often, because this card has a lot more potential than that. If you cast this for X equals 2, that's going to be 8 mana in total. That's going to be 10 damage to 2 targets. So this can pretty much take out any 2 creatures, or you can dome your opponents to the face. Still nice, but the next X value is what you probably want to shoot for. If X equals 3, that means you're paying 11 mana in total. Now that might seem like a lot, but with certain commanders in certain decks, that's pretty easy to achieve. Anyways, when you do that, that's going to be 15 damage to 3 targets. So basically any creature that's not indestructible, can regenerate, or has hexproof is dead. And of course, 15 damage to each of your opponent's faces is a pretty huge amount as well. Obviously, the more and more mana that you put into this spell, the more you get out of it. You are exponentially adding in the total amount of damage that you are dishing out. If you cast this for X equals 4 at 14 mana, that's going to be 20 damage to 4 targets. So basically 80 damage overall. So again, if you look at it from a total damage perspective, you go from 5 damage to 20 to 45, all the way up to 80 and more if you keep adding. Now, obviously going this high or any higher requires an absurd amount of mana. But again, this is Commander, and there are a lot of decks and commanders out there that can give you that absurd amount of mana. So this can be a flexible removal spell and finisher for a good amount of decks out there. So now let's move on and talk about some commanders that might want to consider this card. But before we do, a huge thank you to some members of my playgroup for pointing out some of these. So thank you to Baron, Eric, Dan, and Eddie for the fantastic discussion. But I do not look forward to losing to your personal commanders when you cast this. Now, one of the first commanders that came to my mind was actually a recent one with Galazeth Prismari. If you haven't seen my full episode on Galazeth, make sure you go check that out. Basically, Galazeth is somewhat of an Urza-type commander with a restriction. It has, when it enters the battlefield, create a treasure token, artifacts you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color, spend this mana only to cast an instant or sorcery spell. So with this commander, you can build a deck around creating a ton of artifact tokens and then utilizing them for mana. Now you can only utilize that mana for instants and sorceries, but there are still a lot of powerful things that you can do with that. For example, tap all of them for mana, then cast Dramatic Reversal to untap all of them, then tap them all again, and then dump all that mana into something like Crackle with Power. Yeah, with this commander, you can pretty easily get up to 20 plus mana in Crackle with Power. And at 20 power, that would be X equals 6, so yeah, 30 damage to 6 targets. That's pretty good. Another one that came to my mind was Neheb the Eternal. Neheb has, at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, add red to your mana pool for each 1 life your opponents have lost this turn. So essentially, damaging your opponents nets you mana. You cast something like Price of Progress to dish out a lot of damage for cheap, and then you generate an absurd amount of mana and you dump that into Crackle with Power. Conversely, you could use Crackle with Power to dump mana into something else if you wanted to. Say that you cast it in your pre-combat main phase for 8 mana, that's going to be 10 damage to 2 opponents. Your opponents in total lost 20 life, so you gain 20 mana, and then you can utilize that for, well, other big burn spells. So there's some more flexibility with how you can use Crackle with Power with a commander like this. Next up, one of Baron's commanders that we'll probably be adding in this card is Roshin Meanderer. Roshin taps for 4 mana, but you can only spend this mana on costs that contain X. So yeah, Crackle with Power definitely applies. Roshin decks tend to focus on casting giant X spells with an absurd amount of mana, so yeah, Crackle with Power is going to be no different. And speaking about an absurd amount of mana, there's Ramos Dragon Engine. Ramos has whenever you cast a spell, put a ++1 counter on Ramos Dragon Engine for each of that spell's colors. Remove 5 ++1 counters from Ramos, add white, white, blue, blue, black, black, red, red, green, green to your mana pool, or in other words, double Wooburg. Activate this ability only once each turn. So yeah, once you've got those 5 counters on Ramos, that's a free 10 mana when you need it. Let's just say that you even just have 7 lands in play. For 17 mana total, that is X equals 5. That will be 25 damage to 5 targets. Yeah, that can take out some things and some players. Next up, let's move on to a partner commander though with Elena Kessig Trapper. She has tap, add an amount of red equal to the greatest power among creatures you control that enter the battlefield this turn. Now, obviously, a lot of things depend on what other commander you're using this with. Let's just say you're using a green commander with it though. And you've got some creatures in play, and you can play something like Galta for 2 mana. So you can tap this for 12. And if you've got a way to untap her, that's even more mana. So yeah, this can get pretty absurd pretty quickly. And speaking of absurd, there's Kaikar Wind's Fury. It has whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create a 1/1 white spear creature token with flying, and sacrifice a spirit, add red. So if you really feel like it, after creating all those spirits by casting a ton of non-creature spells, you can just sack them all and then cast one giant non-creature spell. That's a high-risk, high-reward play, and you probably should have some counterspell backup. But you only live once, so go for it. Another commander that might want to consider this is Grand Warlord Rada. She has whenever one or more creatures you control attack, add that much mana in any combination of red and or green until end of turn you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. Let me put this in Gruul terms. Swing creatures, big mana, cast spell, burn opponents, they dead. Yeah, that about sums it up. But commanders that produce a bunch of mana aren't the only ones that want to consider this. Ones that actually reduce the cost definitely do as well. So Mizzix of the Is Magnus is probably the first one that comes to mind when it comes to that. Mizzix has whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell with converted mana cost greater than the number of experience counters you have, you get an experience counter. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each experience counter you have. So basically, cast spells that are progressively bigger reduce the amount of mana of all your spells by more and more and more. And with Mizzix, you can also get a lot of value out of ritual-type spells. So not only can you generate an absurd amount of mana in one turn, but you can also reduce the cost of that spell by a ton. So you can cast Crackle with Power for a huge X value. And another cost-reducing commander is Saheeli the Gifted. One of her +1s is the next spell you cast this turn costs 1 less to cast for each artifact you control as you cast it. So Saheeli decks can make an absurd amount of artifacts and then reduce the cost of a huge spell. So with Saheeli, the more artifacts that you have, the more pain your opponents are going to be in. And then another cost reducer is Kazan Royal Chaser. It has tap, the next instant or sorcery spell you cast this turn costs X less to cast, where X is the number of wizards you control as this ability resolves. So basically get a bunch of wizards out there and then cast some big spells. But the final commander that I want to bring up that might want to consider this card is Wart the Raid Mother. When Wart enters the battlefield, you create 2 1/1 red and green Goblin Warrior creature tokens. And then each red or green instant or sorcery spell you cast has Conspire. Now Conspire might not be that known of a mechanic, so I'll read it here. As you cast the spell, you may tap 2 untapped creatures you control that share a color with it. When you do, copy it and you may choose new targets for the copy. So Wart doesn't technically generate you any mana or reduce the cost of a spell, but she can definitely help you copy it. And of course, because you're in green, you're going to be copying all of your ramp spells. So you get a ton of lands out, then you cast Crackle with Power, and then you copy it, and then your opponents are very, very dead. And I'm sure there are plenty of commanders out there that I didn't mention, so in the comments below if you can think of one, let me know. Regardless, now it's time for me to give you my final thoughts on this card. It's a really interesting design, and it can have a huge impact in those big mana decks. It can be a flexible removal spell, but it can also be a finisher. Overall, it's just really interesting to see a triple X spell, because at this point I believe the only other one that we have seen is Astral Cornucopia, which is a mana rock. So I can't wait to see how they explore this space in the future as well. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.